Adventures in Imperfect Living.
Greetings, folks. Welcome to another edition of Adventures in Imperfect Living. I'm Greg Willits from RosaryArmy.com.
And I'm Jennifer Willits, his wife.
Got a interesting conversation ahead for you today. We had a conversation. How many times can I say conversation? With Thomas Stork. He's the author of a new book. It's called The Prosperity Gospel, How Greed and Bad Philosophy Distorted Christ's Teachings. Super smart guy, a professor. I wanted to talk to him a little bit about his background as a teacher, but didn't get a chance to do so. He's a contributing editor at New Oxford Review, the Chesterton Review, publications all over the place. This newest book is from Tan Books. We wanted to have him on a couple of months ago, and when our summer went crazy, that got delayed. So we're very glad that we're able to share this conversation with you right now, all about the prosperity gospel. It's such an interesting conversation. It went in directions that I certainly didn't anticipate. I think you're going to enjoy it as well. Here is Thomas Stork. We are ashamed to admit, Thomas, that even though I'm a cradle Catholic, Jennifer came into full communion in the church in 99. We got married in 95. Around 99, 2000, we really started taking our quest for Jesus more seriously. It wasn't necessarily always in the Catholic Church, and we might have been somewhat attracted to some Protestant preachers that were espousing the prosperity gospel that you talk about in your book.
Okay, you have to remember the prayer of Jabez was also launching right around that time when we were newly married, and that got on our radar as well.
That was kind of the starting point for us. Do you remember the prayer of Jabez?
I do remember. I don't think I read the whole thing through, but I did read parts of it, yeah.
Yeah, it was like, oh, Lord, that you would enlarge my territory. You know, it's basically like, make me have more stuff, God, is basically what the prayer was. And I'm conflicted, and I think that this is something we could talk about a little bit. 4 things like that, and in your book, The Prosperity Gospel, and I love the subtitle, How Greed and Bad Philosophy Distorted Christ's Teaching. I think about those times when I was reading Prayer of Jabez. I did want more stuff, right? I felt like, God, make it easier for us to have a house, make it easier for these things to happen. But what's interesting is, looking back at it with hindsight, He did enlarge our territory. He led us to things like total consecration to Jesus through Mary. He led us to a deeper holiness. He led us to things to help people to grow in their faith. And we've been very blessed to actually have a larger territory in the fields of ministry, but not necessarily financially. So there's this weird idea of praying for more, but does God give us, if we pray for more with the idea of the prosperity gospel, will He give us more of what we actually need?
Well, John Paul II makes the distinction in Interdecimus between having more and being more. And I think they're talking about the latter. And God does want us to be more, but not necessarily to have more. And as far as wanting to have more, we don't tend to make a distinction between needs and wants. In fact, ordinary economics that you'll find if you take economics at almost every institution in the country, doesn't make it that distinction. Whatever you want is the same as whatever you need. And but as Catholics, we have to realize that, as St. Thomas said, the appetite for natural riches is not infinite, because you can only have so much. I mean, if you have 10 houses, you can't even live in them. And they just collect dust. If you have 100 pairs of shoes, you're not going to wear them. So in fact, you won't have room in your closet. So needs and wants, that's a very important distinction between that. And there's nothing wrong with praying for our needs, even though we recognize that God might not even supply us with our needs sometimes in terms of temporal goods, but He'll always supply us with the grace we need. As I quote Cardinal Newman in the book, that if I'm in sickness, that's part of God's plan. If I'm in doubt, if I'm in perplexity, and so on. So, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be more, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to have our needs supplied, or even our temporal needs, always keeping in mind that according to the will of God.
Was there some point where, in your own life that because you've written a whole bunch of other books and books that have covered a wide array of subjects, at some point you had to have said, there's a need for a book that counters this prosperity gospel and to write it from a Catholic perspective. Did something personally happen in your life or something that you were witnessing that really started to sort of gnaw at you that you saw the need for a book like this?
Well, to be honest with you, TAN approached me.
Okay.
And they asked me if I would write a book on the prosperity gospel. And my response was, well, yes, but it's easy to make fun of the prosperity gospel. That's, you could write something like that without any trouble. I wanted to show why something is weird, why something is bizarre, as the prosperity gospel caught on. And my original suggestion for a title was Seedbed for the Prosperity Gospel, or Seedbed of the Prosperity Gospel, because I wanted to show this didn't come out of nowhere. The kind of thinking that led to the Prosperity Gospel has been around in this country for a long time, and has infected practically every area of our life. So, yeah, that was really the way it went, the trajectory of it all.
Well,
and I've been interested in the church's teaching on the social order, on economics for a long time, even before I was a Catholic.
is the pursuit of prosperity wrong? Just the pursuit of more money, the pursuit of a way to provide for your family, like the desire for good things is pretty wired into us. We don't necessarily see it as an evil thing, but more of a responsibility that I think American families feel very pressured to attain. Are we slipping into a prosperity gospel mindset by accident?
Well, I think often we are. I mean, it's what I said before about needs and wants. It's you can't decide what the difference is with a mathematical certitude. I need X amount of money to the penny, but you can get some rough idea of, we need this to have a decent life, a human life, kind of life God intends for mankind to have. But on the other hand, to have a lot more than that is going to be the pursuit of the kind of thing that the prosperity gospel is after. And it's not really the case that everybody is always trying to get more. For example, in one of the books that I cited in here, Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, he talks about in the 19th century in Germany, the cloth merchants who they operated by contracting out with various people who would make the cloth in their own homes. And then they would get the cloth, collect the cloth, and take it to a wholesaler and so on. But they were content. They really didn't work very hard. They were content with a customary level of income. They weren't always trying to maximize their profits. They weren't looking out for, here's an opportunity to make an extra buck. I can cut corners here, and so on and so on and so on. The way we think. And so they were content with a sufficiency. And there have been cultures that have been more content with the sufficiency than our culture has. Our culture is not generally content with the sufficiency. No. It's always looking for, how can I get more? How can I see an opportunity here. Well, an opportunity for money, yeah, but what is it taking away from? Is it taking away from time with your family? Is it taking away from time with talking to the neighbors? Is it taking away from time for prayer, for study, whatever?
I found, Thomas, that it's what you're saying is true, but it's also so frustrating to find the right balance, to know, one point in the Lord's Prayer, we say, give us, this day our daily bread. Do we just pray for just that amount? Or do we at the same time plan for some unknown future to be, taken care of in our retirement, to have X amount of dollars in the bank? And, and so we actually have a financial advisor, and we meet with him once a year. And he always asks us the question, how much do you want to have, available to you on a monthly basis when you retire? And we were like, well, we're dependent upon God for just today. Trying to have an idea of what we're supposed to do 20 or 30 years from now is so foreign to us, in part because we don't know how to walk that line of give us this day our daily bread and let me take action to prepare some kind of thing for the future. And so we find ourselves, and this is why the prosperity gospel is such an interesting topic, is sometimes I feel like, and I'm speaking as a married couple, that we don't know, kind of like, I'll just say it this way, we don't know what we're allowed to ask for. We don't want to ask for more than what we should be asking for. We don't want to be greedy. We want God just to provide, but sometimes we feel like we're not being prudent and trying to do more to take care of our family long term, that kind of thing. And I'll say this, I'll use this as a little bit of a, companion to the pseudo topic question that I'm asking here. So Jennifer's father died in 2015, and her mother passed away just this last December. Her dad did, he was a blue collar worker his whole life, working. When he retired, he was working for the post office, fixing their machines at one of their main facilities. But he did a great job of just kind of squirreling away money so that his wife was cared for after he died. And I'm not doing that same kind of thing that my father-in-law did. And so he seemed to have understood a prudent way of going about doing something that his wife was able to be cared for the 7-8 years after he died, until she died. What's the balance? How do we find that balance so that we don't fall into the prosperity gospel, but we also don't become so ignorant in our actions that we're doing nothing?
Well, I think you could say there's a two or threefold way of approaching that. The first would be prayer. I mean, the closer we get to our Lord in prayer, and the more we seek His will, He'll give us a mind like the mind of Christ, as St. Paul said. And then reading what the spiritual writers of the church have said, and also reading the not just the spiritual writers, but the papal social encyclicals, because they touch on these things. I mean, they're very much aware, especially the older ones like Pius XI. He was a giant in this area, and it's an absolute incredible what he wrote on these areas. And he was well aware of the tension that you're talking about. And everybody, especially if you have a family. I have a family. We have 15 grandchildren now, and we like to do something to help them too. But you can't lay down something a priori. You can't say, okay, in your life you need to have this much money, and you need to have this large savings account. And if you go beyond that, you're falling into the prosperity gospel. It depends on so many circumstances, and God knows that. I mean, especially with the uncertainty of the economy and the uncertainty of things in general. I understand why people want to err on the safe side. And I tend that way myself. But it depends on it. But it's not just so much saving for the future as how we live now. Do we have all the latest gadgets? How often do we feel like we have to have a car replaced every 5 years? And so on and so on. Those are signs that maybe we're falling into the materialistic mindset. I mean, people, as someone has pointed out, as family size in the U.S. has gotten smaller since around 1970, the size of our houses have grown, and it's insane. It makes no sense whatsoever. And in other countries, people aren't always looking for the biggest house. And I'm not saying that. I'm trying to jump on the U.S. too much, but we do. I have to be honest. We do have this built in. We are really the seedbed for the prosperity gospel. It's the kind of weirdness that probably wouldn't have taken off most places.
Well, one thing I appreciate about your book, Thomas, is how you called us out in the best of ways, because while it would be easy to take the position of being a victim and like, oh, the world is bad, I'm just this Catholic woman trying to live a very simple life in a very, secular world that's all about wealth and the pursuit of gaining things, whether it be money or, accolades or praise. But at the same time, showing us how even in our attempt to be holy, we're still kind of participating in our own way in prosperity gospel. I like how you say how the things that we buy, the things that we choose to buy are very much under our control. Like we decide what we bring into our homes at the end of the day. We decide what vacation we want to, treat our family to. And that in those choices, it should be kind of held to the right order. Like your book talked about this hierarchical order of things, and that God should be rightly so at the height and the summit of our order of life, and not the attainment of goods and the attainment of things, and that life is not on top and God is somewhere on the bottom. But I liked how you challenged us to really look at the choices we are actually making at the end of the day. and where we are choosing to be formed. Like the TV we're watching, the videos we're watching, they're all participating in our formation, whether we want to admit it or not. It is forming us and it is influencing us. And when we watch YouTube all day and we see a good representation of the wealth of the world on those videos, it does kind of like almost subconsciously show us this is what we should be attaining for. They have something I don't have, which is one of my biggest gripes with Facebook. I mean, I don't go on there much, but it's just like this endless parade of look what I have, look what I'm eating today, look at where I'm vacationing, and you're not. But I am, and I love you so much, I want to share it with you. And it shows you, but these are good people. These are my friends. And I don't know how I feel about that, but it doesn't make me feel very good. And it's like, this is just part of how we're all kind of entangled in this web on some level to prosperity gospel. And it's touching us. Even when we're trying to avoid it, it's still getting at us. I mean, do you find that same thing happening in your life right now with your marriage and your grandchildren?
Yeah, it can be very difficult to decide. Like, for example, I guess maybe the thing that our children are all grown now, but the thing that I think about my wife going out to eat. Well, how often should we go out to eat? And how often is being luxurious? And how often is just reasonable? And you can't really, as I said before, you can't really say, well, this week we will only go out twice, or only go out once, or 3 times, or whatever. It's hard to know, and it depends on a lot of factors. So I don't mean to be vague and to avoid the question. I might sound like I am, but I'm just trying to point out that it's for so many factors. We really have to ask for the mind of Christ. We really have to ask Our Lady, help us to be like your Son. And I know that this sounds like I'm just evading things, but it's because you can't really say. But I mean, like, for example, you mentioned vacations, and it's funny. My father was a public librarian, and we had what I considered to be a reasonable middle class life. We didn't go on vacations. We didn't have a car until I was in 6th grade, and a lot of places I know you couldn't do that nowadays. I don't think you could do that here where we live, but they had better bus service in those days. So, but we never missed that. We never thought, oh, we're being deprived because we're not going on vacation. It just never occurred to us that, oh, gee, other people go on vacation. Why don't we? Didn't bother. We didn't miss it. So there are a lot of things. It's easy to get hooked on things and think, this is normal. This is natural. We need to do this. In fact, we hardly ever went out to eat when I was little. So I guess that's one example where I can point the finger at myself and say, gee, I'm doing a lot more than my parents did.
Well, and then that's the interest. That's one of the things I wrestle with, right? It's sort of like, well, okay, we live in a time, we live in a place where these things are happening. We're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world, and it's such a wrestling thing. I feel like we're tempted with scrupulosity on a daily basis in trying to fight against the prosperity gospel, because you could start dinging yourself for, well, we went out, as you said, 2 times or 3 times in the past week. I'm not being very prudent with our money. I'm not being very wise. I'm not living with the heart of Christ. Or am I? Because this is the time and the place that we're in. And you said something a few minutes ago, Thomas, that I want to touch on. You talked about other places in the world. So it sounds like this, while the prosperity gospel can be found in pockets around the world, is this primarily an American and North American issue, or is this a globally pervasive thing?
Well, it's some of each. I mean, the root of it, of course, is in the sin of our first parents, who one day when Adam and Eve fell, that messed up the human race until our Lord returns. But you can have things that are worse and that are better. And as I tried to point out in the book, there are 2 elements in American life that are not present everywhere. One of them is the pervasive Protestantism, and not just, say, like Anglican Protestantism that retains a certain number of Catholic elements, but the most radical kind of Protestants that came to New England, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, the Quakers that came to the Middle Colonies, They were the Protestants that were trying to distance themselves as much as possible from anything that smacked of Catholicism. So the kind of restraints that Catholicism put on human appetites were in many cases just jettisoned. If you, I quote in the book Henry Adams in that wonderful book of his, Mont Saint Michel en Chartres, where he talks about how in 13th century France, a huge amount of money was invested in building churches. And when you consider the state of the economy in France at the time, a gigantic sum was invested in churches, not in shopping malls, not in swimming pools, but in churches, and beautiful churches that they had to pay craftsmen to do very detailed and meticulous work to make the stained glass windows, the statues, the buttresses, and so on. And so we don't have that in the United States. We don't have any consciousness of the Catholic background of civilization. And that's one of the factors that has made the U.S. fertile ground for this prosperity gospel. The other one I mentioned is the pervasive influence of the philosophy of John Locke. And somebody said, Lewis Hartz, who was an historian, that in the United States, Locke is a national cliche. His way of looking at society is just taken for granted. And many people aren't aware there's any alternative. In fact, you're probably aware that right now in Catholic circles, there's a debate occurring about what is called post-liberalism. And liberalism here doesn't mean liberalism as we ordinarily use the term, like talking about the Democratic Party, for example. It means the pervasive classical liberalism, of which both Republicans and Democrats are examples in different ways. And people are waking up to the fact that, and liberalism, and Locke was one of the chief exponents of liberalism. He was, in a way, in the English-speaking world, he was the one who crystallized it, made it seem palatable, laid down a simple way of applying it. And Catholics are realizing now, this isn't really compatible with Catholic thinking, Catholic living. And they're looking back, for example, at Pope Leo XIII, who was the Pope in the last third of the 19th century, who was a remarkable Pope. I mean, just incredibly remarkable. And he kind of restated the principles of Catholic doctrine as applied to the social order, both political and economic, in a series of remarkable encyclicals. A lot of people are aware of his encyclical Rerum Novarum, which is certainly noteworthy, but that wasn't the only one. There were other encyclicals that in which he talked about the political order, how the state should relate to God, how the state had a duty as such to honor God, not just you and me as individuals, but society has a duty to honor God. And when you have that kind of recognition, then you realize, wait a minute, we're in this more than just piling up good for ourselves.
When you talk about the liberalism, and this might tie together with, you also discuss how this idea of the prosperity gospel has corrupted education to a certain extent. How so?
Well, I say, yeah, pretty much totally.
Yeah.
Pius XI, in his encyclical Divini Elias, said that education is not an individual thing; it's a social thing. I mean, sure, it's individual in the sense that we're forming ourselves, but we're forming ourselves for the sake of what contribution we can make to the common good, both on the spiritual level and on the material level, whatever our vocation might be. But most people think of education as simply, what can I do to get ahead? How can I maximize my income, really? I mean, you'll see that ROI, return on investment. And you'll find plenty of websites. If you put in Google education ROI, you will get all kinds of advice about how you should or shouldn't invest in college, because you might make better money if you invested in the stock market or something like that. And that's a totally perverted way of looking at education. And education is yeah, sure, it's for ourselves, but it's also for what we can contribute to the common good. It's not just a means of how much we can make money. But in the United States, when we talk about higher education, we primarily say, well, people who go and get college degrees where people who get graduate degrees will make X amount of money more than others. That's not the point. The point is it part of our vocation? Does it help us to contribute to fulfilling our vocation, to aiding the common good, and so on? So education has been really radically individualized.
But is that why we see so many colleges, non-Catholic colleges, are no longer places where let me back up for a second, Thomas, and try this again. We know that it's oftentimes problematic to send our Catholic kids, to secular colleges. There's all sorts of studies showing how a great number of them lose their Catholicism when that happens. So how do we continue to push forward on a strong education in this world, in this nation in particular, so that they're not being corrupted, so that they are actually going to be those contributing members of society, and get that education that's going to help them to do that without them losing their souls? And that seems to be, that's not really the point of your book, but you seem like a good person who'd be able to have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mentioned that briefly in the book, because that is obviously a great concern. And when our children were coming of college age, we said, okay, here's your choices. And we gave them all the choices of good Catholic colleges. You can choose one of these, but that's it. If you want to go somewhere else, if you're 18, well, we can't stop you, but we can't help you. We don't want to help you either.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have to be very, very careful about not just high schools, but not just colleges, but the whole formal education of our children.
Yeah.
Because you're right, it's extremely important, extremely problematical, and there are a lot of Catholic colleges that are Catholic colleges in name only, and that will destroy our children's faith. But that's a separate issue from the issue I was bringing up about the commercialization of education. Those go hand in hand. Well, I shouldn't say hand in hand. They're parallel to each other, but they're different issues. And you can have a Catholic college, for example, that was just as interested in saying, well, we'll help you make a lot of money and you won't lose your faith. Well, the second part is great, but the first part is a little problematic. Those are two issues, and they're both important. I agree. And that's why there should be more of these good Catholic colleges. And we should, and I'm always appalled when people say, oh, my son got into Harvard. And oh, I see. No, okay, you don't care about his continuing in the faith.
It's like, I'm sorry, your kid's going to Harvard.
I'll start fasting for him now. But this is the same thing. The same thing, though. So we have the educational institutions have been poisoned to some extent by it, but also our churches themselves. This is even in the Catholic churches, the idea of the prosperity gospel. How do we kind of see the signs of prosperity gospel infiltrating into individual parishes?
Well, one thing would be, obviously, is anybody preaching on this? There were 10 commandments, not just 2, or not just 3 or 4. There were 10, and we have to preach on all of them. And I say a lot of times it's not being done. So people aren't preaching about materialism. Priests aren't preaching about materialism and about the seductions of the material world. So that's obviously a sign. And then we tend to be, it's funny, Americans tend to be love programs. And instead of saying, well, I'm just going to preach the gospel to the, no, we have to have a program to do that. We'll give it a name, we'll brand it. And then we can have a nice logo for it. And those things are really necessary, or at least not as necessary as we think they are. And yet we tend to make everything glitzy. And that's not directly the prosperity gospel, of course, but it's the same kind of mindset, I think, that is behind the prosperity gospel. Something that's glitzy, something that makes a splash, and that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, hey, we could be guilty of it right here, right? It's like we've worked really hard to build up a studio and trying to make it look really nice and that kind of thing. And by the way, this is the kind of thing we go back and forth on. This is like, to what you just said. Are all these trappings necessary? Do we need to put all this extra work into it? to be able to proclaim the gospel. And sometimes we feel like we're competing against the prosperity gospel by doing some of the prosperity gospel things to try to get people not to pay attention to the prosperity gospel. It's like it's back and forth, back and forth.
I understand that exactly, because you feel like you see, I won't mention the organization, but it's a good Catholic organization that we contribute to and we've had connections with. And their newsletter was very plain, just black and white. I was more than satisfied. Well, recently it's become color. Was that necessary? I don't know. Maybe they felt that if they didn't do that, they wouldn't attract people. But maybe just because I'm in my 70s, so maybe it's just because when I was young, things weren't quite as glitzy as they are now. So I really can't judge how people in their 20s and 30s are thinking now, because, but to me, I was perfectly happy with the black and white.
And I think about some of those black and white things. It's like what's interesting is then you get all nostalgic and then they become retro, and then that becomes a whole other thing. It's like what can we do to pay extra money so that we don't look like we're glitzy if we go backward? It's just these are the kinds of things that keep me awake at night. They really are. Of like wanting to do the right thing, wanting to make sure that we're walking the right path, but then how easy it is to get slipped into, which points to the nefariousness of the prosperity gospel and how much it has infiltrated everything, that it adds, confusion is from the devil, and it's added so much confusion even to how we try to proclaim the gospel. What were you going to say, Jennifer?
Well, the phrase prosperity gospel almost evokes lots of different instant opinions on the hearers of that particular phrase. And it struck me as I pondered that phrase, prosperity gospel, and tried to just sort of sit with the layers that are packed within that phrase. And I wondered what would be the opposite phrase of that. And I came up with poverty gospel.
That'll sell 1,000 books. That's right away.
But hold on now. If you think about it, it does jive a little bit more with like the Beatitudes.
Yeah, blessed are the poor in spirit.
And suddenly you realize, because it's not just what it seems, Christ, like how did he live? And poverty is exalted. You think about what's in the Magnificat. It's always the opposite of what the world is saying, like, oh, you'll be successful if you have wealth and lots of material goods that can be seen exteriorly. And yet everything in the scripture is about the humility of a person. It's about going lower. It's about getting on your knees. It's this other approach, and that you'll be exalted by God for that, So I think the phrase could catch on.
Oh,
Poverty gospel.
I want to see that happening.
What do you think of that?
Well, at one point in the editing process, somebody suggested a title for this book, "The Anti-Prosperity Gospel."
Yeah, that's.
I didn't think that would be a good title.
But going against it, well, it's the thing is that what I wish that people could get from this conversation, what I hope they get from this conversation, is not to be number one, not to be where I constantly am, where I see fearfulness come out of me in overthinking some decisions. But at the same time, I really like what you said of probably the reason why that fearfulness is there is because in the instances of money, I don't seek the heart of Christ enough. That I don't seek in that particular area. I seek the heart of Christ in so many other areas, but in the area of our finances, I don't necessarily do that on a regular basis. You talked about prayer. You talked about seeking that heart. What are some practical ways that if people have unrest in terms of finances, in terms of am I spending too much? Am I not spending enough? Am I saving enough? Am I not saving enough? How can they seek out that? What are ways of prayer? What are ways that they can seek out that heart of Christ and make that in that particular area of prosperity or poverty in their own lives?
Well, I'm never comfortable giving advice about prayer, because I feel like I kind of just get by with it, as it were.
Yeah.
Trying to do it my best as I can. But, one thing is, as I said before, our culture was not formed by Catholicism. Our culture was formed by a very radical kind of Protestantism, and then early on by the secularism of Locke. So if we look at cultures that were formed by Catholicism over centuries, not just, in a short time, over centuries, sometimes we can get ideas there of, well, gee, how do they live, or how did they live? Because these Catholic cultures, as you are both aware, are rapidly secularizing, have been so for the last 50 years or more. So yeah, I mean, I'm not saying we should look at how people live in Spain or France, or Italy right now, and say, "Oh, we have to copy that." But if we look at historically how how that was lived, that is a way of getting some ideas. Now, how do we do this? Well, most of us, uh, it's funny. I'm going to take a European trip in order to fight against the prosperity gospel. but there's plenty of literature, for example. Sometimes descriptions, sometimes novels that do describe these things that can give us some idea of, well, this is how people live. This is what they were content with. This is what they regarded the good life as. Because there's nothing wrong with God didn't want us to be miserable on earth, and ordinarily He doesn't mind us seeking for His sufficiency in our material goods. But what that sufficiency is a matter of can change a lot, and what we think of as sufficiency here in the United States in 2023 is not necessarily a reasonable sufficiency. How many cars do we have? How many this? How many that? How big is our house? And how much do we need? And what are we spending our time on? Is it prayer? Is it the intellectual life? I mean, that's one area that's really neglected in Catholic life in the U.S. is the intellectual life, reading solid stuff, and trying to form our minds to be like the mind of Christ, and that's something that you could talk an hour about. Just what does that mean? And I wrote one of my books is called "Seeing the World with Catholic Eyes." It's kind of an extended interview with me, and that's one of the things I talk about in there is Catholic reading and how to form our minds and as a consequence how to form our lives according to the faith and according to the wisdom of our ancestors, because we can't get all the wisdom from ourselves or from even from our parish, and ordinarily God doesn't. God works in ordinary ways. Not everyone's the recipient of extraordinary graces. And so if we're not the recipient of extraordinary graces, we have to make use of the natural means that God has provided. And one of them is reading.
Yeah, I was just looking at the list of books, and I haven't obviously read the book that you just mentioned, Seeing the World with Catholic Eyes, a conversation with Thomas Stork. But we've been, thanks to several friends of ours, paying more attention to the works of John Senior, his list of 1,000, good books and that kind of thing. And sadly seeing it's like, man, I wish I had this 25 years ago when we first became parents. We would have introduced a lot of these to our older kids. Our daughter's kind of benefiting from it now, our 14-year-old. But having not read that book, I'm kind of curious. You brought that up, that Seeing the World with Catholic Eyes. What does that look like to you today in today's world? What would someone expect from that particular book? I'm very curious about that.
Well, after a short section about my upbringing and what kind of some of the things that led me to the faith, we talk about politics, about Catholic social teaching, about the church, the state of the church today, and then at the end I have this section, as I mentioned, about reading, about Catholic books and how to form ourselves in that respect. It's kind of a wide-ranging book, and I can get it if you want and summarize it. It's right over here on the shelf.
I mean, I think the thing that makes me most curious is the idea of furthering our own education in the time that we're at now. I'm not going back to school. I'm not at a point in my life where I'm going to be able to do that, but I want to further my own personal education. I think that that's a valuable topic for all of us to be discussing right now, is like, how do we further that education? One of the things that we're preparing to launch with Rosary Army, and depending on when people see this, it may have already launched, but we're launching something called schoolofmary.com. The idea is to continually push our knowledge base and our practice of the faith so that we can grow in holiness. And so I really, I'm going to pick it up. you don't have to get the book off the shelf right now. You already piqued my curiosity, and I'm sure our producer and video editor will probably put the book up on the screen as well, so people could find out about it too.
And I have a feeling one book sort of leads to the other, and that once you start seeing the world with your Catholic lenses firmly in place, you can see where prosperity gospel is more clearly and how you can be detached from it, which is, I think, one of the best takeaways I can get from how you wrapped up your great book, is this ongoing call to live detached from these prosperous things, because in and of themselves, they are morally neutral. I mean, the latest iPad is just the latest iPad, but how you use it, how you let it control you, or are you controlling it, is always something within our ability to do. And I love that reminder in your book on how we can take a stand and we can participate in restoring things back to how they're supposed to be, so that we're not taken down the river of wealth without knowing and being ignorant along the way. We can do something. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'd like to object a little bit to the idea that technology is neutral. It isn't really neutral. Given the fallen state of mankind and our tendency to take the way of least resistance and the easiest way, I don't think you can really say technology is neutral. Technology tends to take over our lives, and we tend to structure our lives around the technology that we have. And a good example, and I'm not saying whether this example was a worthwhile invention or not, but I think it's obvious how it's taken over. The automobile. The automobile gets us from point A to point B much faster and sometimes safer, sometimes not safer than was formerly the way. But look at all the structures that have arisen from the automobile. Parking lots that take up a huge amount of soil, gas stations, all the accessories that go with automobiles, and our lives, the way we design our cities, so that people don't work downstairs anymore and live upstairs. Their shops downstairs, their homes upstairs. No, they can work hundreds of miles away, or maybe not hundreds, but dozens of miles away, and they can drive. So the automobile has allowed for a particular way of life to evolve. And right now it would be extremely difficult to undo that way of life. But to say that that's neutral, no, it's not neutral. It was, and when we accepted the automobile, we didn't have a conversation. Well, gee, is this worth it? Let's think about it. Let's discuss it. Let's see what are the probable things that will happen if we embrace this new invention. We just accepted it, and all these other accessory things like parking lots and superhighways just came up. And so, yeah, I think we have to take a more nuanced view toward technology than simply say, oh, it's a matter of how we use it. No, it's not. It's much more complex than that.
Oh, well, now.
That's why
Because I understand what you're saying, and I've actually read that about a year or two ago, how the automobile has actually contributed to the destruction of community, and that sense of the old world community where the church was in the center of society and everything flowed and sprung from that. And we all lived in this nice little bubble, if you will, where the church was in the middle, and we all came to it and we all worked together. And then the automobile just isolated us. Now we're all spread out all over the place, isolated, and there's a lot of ruptures and now the society completely supports that. And now it's really hard to come back from things like the invention of the automobile. Now what do? We can't undo that particular can of worms because it came out so many decades ago. So at the same time, while I appreciate the pushback on, the item is the object is not morally neutral so much as it almost sounds diabolical on one level because of what it has destroyed in a way. But at the same time, do we not have cars? I mean, like, we need it to live in this toxic soup of a world that we're in.
That's what I was saying. It's like we're in this time and we're in this place. I don't have a brain strong enough, Thomas,
Believe
to be able to balance all these things. It's
I kind of do want to get away from it all. Like, don't you feel this pull to just sort of you know what? Let's just go live like a hermit. Let's just leave.
One of the things I put down, and I wasn't going to bring this up, but now I will, Thomas. I actually wrote down is one of the notes that as I was going through your book, I found myself thinking about things like homesteading and going off grid and the things like in the Benedict option and just rounding up the wagons, that kind of thing. And we talk about that of buying a chunk of property, but then it's like, is that prosperity? Building a chunk of property, building a house, and living simply there. Having other Catholics nearby. We have a lot of Catholic friends. We actually live in an area where there is a little bit of Catholic community that's been building up, and some of these people have bought chunks of property and rounded up the houses. That kind of thing. I don't know what the question is, but
is
it seems
that the
like,
answer?
Do we need to be pushing back more in that direction?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, as I said before, I'm not. It might sound like I'm objecting to the car, but what I'm really objecting to, because I'm not. Maybe I do object to the car, maybe I don't. But what I'm really objecting to is that we never had the conversation about the car.
Well,
we never said, "Is this a good idea or not?" We just accepted it because technology is neutral.
Yeah.
Well, okay, the car. I admit the car. We can't get rid of it now. It's too embedded. But what about the things that are coming down the road? What about the new things that are coming out? Do we really need? I mean, people think they need iPads. Well, I managed to get along without one. I don't know how, but I do. And I'm not saying that I hope to brag, but I'm just saying that it is possible. To do without some of these things. And you've probably heard. I mean, I'm sure you've read how there's some discussion right now of how people who always have their smartphone and they're hooked to that, and you see a couple walking down the street, both of them on their smartphones instead of talking to each other. This is not technology neutral, because given our fallen state, we're going to take the path of least resistance most of the time, unless we're saints, and most of us are not saints. And so this is one of the reasons. What I wanted to say before, this is one of the reasons why in our reading we need to read more than simply books about spirituality. We need to read Catholic history. We need to read expositions of Catholic doctrine, of Catholic social teaching. People like Hilaire Belloc, for example, G.K. Chesterton, Christopher Dawson, some of my favorite authors, who talked about Catholicism and society, Catholicism history, and great minds, obviously, and a lot of stuff that we real well could profit from.
Well, we could keep talking and talking and talking, Thomas. I'm amazed that the time just passed as quickly as it did. The book is called The Prosperity Gospel. We'll put links to all of these things in the show notes and underneath the video, or however you're consuming this conversation. But we really appreciate the time that you put into putting this book together, but also the time that you spent with us today, challenging us to keep striving for, quite honestly, greater simplicity and trusting the heart of Jesus and really adopting that heart of Jesus in our own lives. So thank you for being here with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it very much.
I don't know why I am so conflicted on this topic. And it's not
because we're guilty.
No,
No.
I'm confused. I'm so confused by, and I find myself doing this. I think about, for example, when Lily is done with high school and she's ready to go off to college, and where we live right now, I wouldn't mind moving out. We're in a neighborhood, right? We're in a neighborhood with an HOA, and I don't particularly like it. I would like to be in an area where we did have a little bit of nature around us. That would be nice. Is it wrong of me to desire those kinds of things? That's it's that kind of thinking. Because I know that we have worked very hard to try to have the heart of Christ and to trust him more over these last 20 years of doing Rosary Army and going deeper into it. We are completely dependent upon the generosity and providence of God to be able to live now, right? So I feel like sort of like you don't want to be greedy when you're invited over to dinner and take the best cut of steak that's put on the table. And so I go back and forth of, do I want to not be accepting of generosity that God might want to bring our way? And I become blind to it after a while. So it's like I to the point where I allow myself to become paralyzed And sometimes I do nothing in terms of, if God might put something right in front of me and I'll go, no, I'm not going to take it because I don't want to be greedy. But maybe God was like, I just gave you a gift. Why are you not accepting it? You think about the parable of the prodigal son, right? Mm-hmm. The father wanted to bestow all these gifts, put a ring on his son's finger and the best robes and kill the fatted calf and all the things, right? Well, sometimes God wants to bless us. But the problem with the prosperity gospel and why it's so nefarious, I think, is because it has this philosophy of name it and claim it. And we didn't really talk about that with Thomas. The idea of like, if we think of something that we want, well, therefore it came from God and God put it in our hearts and therefore it must be. And that's not always the case. And so I wrestle with what Thomas said, not in a adversarial way. I wrestle to understand how can I peacefully have the heart of Christ so that I can pursue, but if things don't come together, I'm okay with that, right? To be that way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's the detachment that he talked about in his book.
Yeah.
And we do have to use our intelligence and remember to run it through the virtue filter. And it's one thing to receive a gift that's being freely given to you, and it's another thing to be asking for gifts all the time. Now, I say that as if I'm speaking out of two sides of my mouth a little bit because we are in ministry. And so there is a very real reality for all those who work in ministry that depend heavily on donations that they literally do have to ask. And that's hard. It's really hard because you want to make sure you're not crossing any lines of being greedy or wanting prosperity for all the wrong reasons. But God does know our hearts. Thank goodness. That's both scary and comforting. It's like, oh no, he knows our hearts. Yes, he knows our hearts, depending on what's in your heart, right?
But it's like, what I find we do sometimes, like he mentioned getting a new car every few years, right? So
there are people, honestly.
Yeah.
That is what they do.
But my truck, for example, is, how old is it now? 11, 12 years old. We've had the truck. And
it works great.
And it does work great.
It's a great truck.
Well, hold on. 5 years from now, it might suddenly die, and we need to replace. Well, we're not doing anything to save for the next vehicle. We're not, and we don't want to finance the next vehicle. So it's like, I don't know what point I'm trying to make there, but it's like we're constantly going to quote unquote need things in this world. To Thomas's point, when we were talking about cars, it's like it'd be nice not to need it as much. It'd be nice to be in a more self-sufficient or off-grid or whatever.
Well, and I think that's really a big part of this discussion is we're not asking enough questions about the things that we have been assuming we just have to have.
Yeah.
But should we? Is it right? And once you run it through that filter, you're going to get better answers. And so one question that I actually hear coming up more often in terms of cars and families is more families are asking this question: can we downsize? Can we share?
Yeah.
Maybe in a way that we haven't been before. Maybe we don't have to have every single human being has to have their own individual car. Is it possible to share? And it's either yes or no, depending on your situation.
That's the way it was, when I was a little kid and I had a bunch of siblings that were driving at the same time. There weren't a whole bunch of different cars.
Right. But it was possible to make do in the sharing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if our society now supports it as easily as it maybe did 20, 30 years ago. And so again,
because communities have spread out. And so people are going different directions and more distances and it's not as easy to do it.
Right. And access to public transportation is very limited depending on where you live. And so again, but ask yourself the question, have the conversation. Is this thing helpful? Is it going to, take us down the wrong path, or, can we make do without it? In terms of technology, I found that was a very fair question that he brought into the conversation in terms of like the latest gadget. You're much more informed about all the new things that Apple is creating. So they're like creating some new headset, right? Some kind of a VR, augmented reality, and they're just assuming that the world just wants it. But should we? Did Apple ask that? Or are they asking, what can we make? What can we make? How can we make another $1 billion in Q2 of this year? The question needs to be asked, should we? And I'm embarrassed to admit this, but during the conversation, I did have this brief moment of seeing an image of Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic World when he was confronting, Dr. Hammond, and you spent so much money in trying to make these dinosaurs out of this DNA that you found from the mosquito blood and the amber of the tree from the resin. You didn't stop to ask yourself, should you bring the dinosaurs back?
You were so consumed trying to figure out if you could that you didn't ask if you should.
Right.
Yeah.
And then look at the mess that you've created with life right now. And so those questions still kind of do apply. We need to challenge ourselves. Should we?
Yeah.
Is this really a good idea? And that's all. We're all doing the best we can. Okay, we're all living in the same toxic soup, okay? We understand it's a messed up world, but there are still choices that you make every single day, from what you're eating to what you're watching, what you're buying, the clothes you put on your back, the college that you're just so determined to send your kid to. Ask yourself, is this geared toward holy, virtuous living or not? And what's the best you can do within that framework? And make sure God is in your framework. Because even in the book, we do live in society. We do, have to participate in all these services of the world. But is God at the center of it all? And just run it through that filter. And I think you're going to be in a lot better place.
I have a feeling we might get some feedback on this. If you want to record your feedback, either audio or video, you can do that. Just grab your phone, record yourself with your camera, or record yourself with the microphone and send us the file. You can upload it directly through a special website. You go to rosaryarmy.wetransfer.com, and you'll just click the add the file, and boom, it uploads it super easy. Makes it very convenient for you, and we'll share that in a future episode. You can also send us email directly at feedback@gregandjennifer.com.
Now that's good technology.
That's good use of technology because we get stuff from you.
Your
right?
thoughts. That's all we want.
That's all we want. Your thoughts, your money, your cars.
No.
Land. If you have a whole bunch of land, you just want to offsource to Catholics. We're your Catholics. Just keep that in mind. It's all about prosperity.
No.
It's not.
It's the poverty. We want poverty.
Greater poverty. Yeah, I'm challenged by this. I'm super challenged by this. I know I'll be thinking about this one for a while. Hey, if we could help you in your own prayer life, go check out rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. We have free resources. Free! Don't have to pay for it. It's not about prosperity. Free resources available for you at those websites, including in the new School of Mary. You can find your way towards greater holiness by going through totalconsecration.com. Some of the other great things. We're adding new stuff all the time to School of Mary. It takes time to add stuff. Don't be too greedy, right? We'll get you your stuff when it's good and ready for you. But go check it out. There's a lot of wonderful things, new website, and we're very excited about the progress that this apostle has been able to make, not only over the last 20 years, but just this year in particular, including our ability to send you free rosary, pray along with you through our audio prayers and other resources. So go check that out. Pray your rosary every single day, folks.
And do whatever it takes to be devout, reverent, and holy.
Thanks to Thomas Stork for being on the program. Talk to you again in a few days. Please pray for our family, pray for our marriage, pray for our apostolate. God bless, folks.
Bye-bye.